Hi, everyone. Before we get to today's episode of Jung in the World, I just have a few quick announcements. First, we have begun our annual fundraising drive. Now is the time if you want to support the Institute and this podcast, please make a donation at jungchicago.org/give. Also, we have new programs available on the website, live programs in person and online, and there will be new ones coming. George Bright is going to be talking in May. Join our mailing list to get more information about that when it's online. Thanks.
Welcome to Jung in the World, a podcast of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. I'm Patricia Martin, and I'll be your host. Today, we're talking with Dan Shaw about his seminal book, Traumatic Narcissism in Recovery, which offers powerful insight into relational trauma from a clinical, personal, and even spiritual perspective. I'm going to go ahead and introduce you, Dan, but welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Daniel Shaw is a psychotherapist trained in trauma-informed psychotherapies. He's in private practice in New York City and Nyack, New York, and he's on the faculty at the National Institute for Psychotherapies in New York. His theory of traumatic narcissism focuses on how the traumatizing narcissist manipulates victims, causing them to be fearful and insecure at the same time as they are becoming more and more dependent on the narcissist. His work has won several awards, and we will link to those as well as his other books in the show notes. Dan, we're so happy to have you on Jung in the World to discuss traumatic narcissism. I came across your book, and I was just taken by the depth of your insight into how the disorder affects other people, people in the narcissist's life. You have a personal story that sort of led you into this specialty as a psychotherapist. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. At the end of my 20s, I was kind of at the end of my rope. The things I'd hoped would be happening for me weren't happening, and I felt very lost and frightened. And friends introduced me to a meditation practice led by an Indian guru, and I was in the theater community in New York then, and many theater people had gotten involved. So I thought, why not? I've been having so much difficulty, feeling so lost, and I was introduced to the guru at his ashram and in upstate New York, and I was blown away, and I immediately began to have powerful, beautiful experiences that persuaded me that I was in the presence of an enlightened master. And of course, this is how that guru was being presented, a spiritual enlightened master, a living saint, even. And I was brought up as a secular Jew, very socially conscious, very progressive in my family, not religious. But this was so powerful and beautiful that I was drawn to follow. And I eventually got all the way in to the point of living and working in the community run by the guru. And I did that for more than 10 years, almost all of my 30s. I believed I was on a mission that was worthwhile and beautiful. And as my time there became increasingly stressful, I was little by little unable to ignore that I was performing devotion, ecstatic devotion and serenity, and I was actually feeling terrible loneliness, isolation, depression, and fear. An incident in which I heard about the cover-up of sexual abuse, actually of somebody that I knew, a young woman, in the ashram, finally broke the spell for me. And I was able to see it for what it was. I at the same time was entering grad school to become a psychotherapist. And the more I studied what had happened, spoke with the people, other people who had left, spoke with victims who had been sexually abused and had been told they were lying and, were the victims of smear campaigns. I realized I had been in a cult. I was in grad school, social work grad school, and I decided for my final paper to write about my experience, and I called it traumatic abuse in cults. This was in 95, 96. So that is the beginning of when I started to learn about narcissism, because I had not studied psychology or psychoanalysis up until this time. I threw myself into those studies, and it became clear to me, especially from the work of Erich Fromm, his books, Escape from Freedom, and his book, The Heart of Man. Those books described a narcissistic personality that fit the guru completely. And I understood that's when I really began to understand the difference between a teacher, a mentor, a beloved guide or elder, and a subjugating, traumatizing narcissist. And that's how I got into the subject from there. I've been helping victims who have left cults and also victims of relationship abuse. I've been helping now for about 30 years with that population.
Wow, that's to be congratulated. I am very struck, though, by one aspect of your story, and that is how narcissists get so good at this. Meaning, what is the charismatic pull? I think that's how you got ensnared.
Right.
Can we go there?
Yeah, sure. The charisma of this kind of narcissist is very powerful. Now, I am not as literate about Jung's work as I would like to be. I know that Freud described the primal father in his group psychology paper. And Kohut, the father of self-psychology, described a messianic narcissist. They are very much alike, Freud's and Kohut's, that version of their idea of a certain kind of narcissist. And both of them describe the charisma that comes from having a completely, almost, well, not almost delusional, an actually delusional sense of their own omnipotence. And that was echoed by Fromm as well, especially. And it was very illuminating for me to think of the guru who I thought, by whom I was so intimidated and so impressed and had felt so much intensity and power. And when I realized that I was mistaking power for love, I was mistaking the delusion of omnipotence for something holy and sacred and transcendent. That delusion of omnipotence is the central aspect of how I understand this kind of traumatizing narcissist. And to be clear, there's all kinds of levels and types of narcissistic people and behaviors. I am very specifically speaking to a subjugating, traumatizing kind of narcissist. So this isn't your annoying relative who brags about their children's honor roll achievements. This is not that. This is really a specific kind of traumatizing person who dominates and controls and sort of that, like a vampire, sucks the life out of a victim.
I thought about that word. It comes up frequently in the book, subjugation. And what subjugation implies is that there is a coercion of some sort and also a surrendering of will. So
Right.
it's not enough to just comply or agree to someone else's idea or direction. You must surrender your will to them. That's
That's right.
another level. And I want to talk more about like how you understood this to be subjugation.
Sure. Well, um, surrender is a word that uh, the psychoanalyst Manny Gent thought of as a kind of a liberating way of breaking through the ego or breaking through your fears and inhibitions and opening yourself to something deeper, more intimate, more personal. And he used surrender to express that kind of experience. He compared it to submission, which was actually a negation of the self, not an expansion, an opening, a liberating of self, but a negation. And that is what I had to come to terms with, was that my surrender to the guru had not been what I thought it was. That was kind of the bait. The switch was submission. And submission or subjugation involves allowing yourself to be defined by the narcissist, who must define you as inferior and in need of him or her. But I'll use the male pronoun just for clarity's sake. The traumatizing narcissist needs to be able to subjugate because that's how he maintains his delusion about himself, about his own perfection and superiority and complete limitless entitlement. He believes that that is who he is. It's not just like a psychopath or a con artist who manipulates and coerces deliberately, consciously, in a criminal way. The traumatizing narcissist is delusional about his belief in his superiority. So subjugation is the only way that he can maintain that delusion. If I can prove my superiority by getting people to agree to it and submit to it, I can maintain that delusion about myself. So that's the difference. With somebody who is a mentor, who I think of as wise and a meaningful and helpful teacher, they're nurturing my freedom, my individuality, my liberation, let's say, my creativity. They want me to find that and express that as me. The traumatizing narcissist wants you to believe that you don't have anything of your own that's of value that he doesn't confer upon you.
Mm-hmm.
That is not somebody who's lifting you up. That's somebody who is controlling and imprisoning you. And that's subjugation.
Yes. And it's an important distinction because you also talk about moments in your therapeutic practice where this idea of, falling into, I would say, as prey almost to these, to a narcissist, that you have to work with patients to get them to understand that their power is a delusion.
Right.
And what I
Exactly.
wonder about is for someone who might be in the chair sitting across from you, is that revealed incrementally? Were they over time they come to see this themselves? Or does it dawn as an epiphany and it's a no going back moment where now the scales have fallen from their eyes and they realize what they were in? Tell me about
Sure.
that.
Well, let's think of two different situations that have a lot of similarities. One would be having followed and worshipped a guru, a spiritual master. Another would be having fallen profoundly in love with somebody and then experience that being in love. It's the same thing, really. You fall in love with the spiritual master the way you fall in love with a lover. And in that relationship, your initial explosion of ecstasy, of feeling found, feeling seen and known begins to change. And little by little in that relationship, you notice that you're often getting belittled or you're often getting humiliated or shamed. And that you feel almost all the time more and more intimidated. So when people come to therapy in or having just left this kind of relationship, they're profoundly confused. How are they supposed to I was too. When I learned of the guru's sexual abuses, and then I learned of so much more that I had been not letting myself think about or know about, you have to ask yourself, how could this person seem to have loved me so deeply, and I felt such deep love? How could this person also be cruel,
Mm-hmm.
humiliating, shaming, belittling? How can this be? Is it me? Is it, am I the crazy one? This is almost everybody's initial situation when they come in. And even if um they've recognized that no, this person was insane. This was abusive. They are still conflicted about this. I felt the greatest love I ever felt. How could it be? What was wrong with me? And how could that person really be? Maybe I'm the one who's wrong and that person really did love me and it's my fault. So that conflict is almost always present to a greater or lesser degree, but it needs to be allowed to enter the conversation without judgment. As the therapist, my role is to validate all sides of that conflict. Yes, that really felt like love. And yes, that really was cruelty. One of the things that happened before I actually left my ex-guru was that I was able to tell a therapist the guru's behavior is terribly cruel. And my therapist said, "You mean tough love?" And I said, "No, I really mean cruelty." And then we had to have that conversation. He was able to listen. Um, so when people are struggling with that conflict, of course, we talk about it, and it takes a while to resolve. There's mourning and grief that has to be allowed to happen, that you loved that much, and it was such a mistake. And you have to forgive yourself. People struggle. Should I forgive my abuser? Long before you're forgiving your abuser, you better be working on forgiving yourself for letting yourself be abused, for not seeing what you didn't see, for, participating in some cases in the abuse if you're in a cult, for example. One of the things I'll say is, look, it really was love, except it was love that was entirely conditional on your submission.
Mm-hmm.
So that felt like love. It was love, but love that's entirely conditional on your submission means that eventually you are negating yourself and letting yourself be negated to the point that you cease to exist, that you literally feel like you've died, and that's when people leave and come to therapy, is they have tried to maintain that love through self-negation for so long that they've negated themselves out of existence just about.
You know, I was planning on having this interview with you, and I ran a little experiment on AI. I
Uh,
ran an experiment on cross-referencing etymology, scientists' entomology, science around parasitic behavior.
yeah, yeah.
And then I asked it to thread that through mythology and especially vampire myth.
Hmm.
What was stunning was how many corollaries there were
Yeah,
to this idea that someone can seep into your consciousness and begin to alter who you are and how you see yourself to create a void, which I assume that control is a desire to keep you there. In other words, you're a captive. And the
yes,
less confidence you have in yourself and your decision making, the more dependent you are on the guru or the lover.
yes,
So it's an entrapment of sorts.
yes, it is. And people can a good comparison would be the domestic violence situation. Now that involves physical battering and which is profoundly intimidating and humiliating, right? But these relationships I'm describing have the same intimidation and humiliation without the physical battering. Almost always without that, because a traumatizing narcissist is delusional and wants to believe that they're an honorable person and that they're always innocent. So they avoid doing illegal things and they avoid doing violent things as much as possible. When they cross over, I think of those as sociopathic narcissists rather than the ones that I'm talking about. The ones that I'm talking about are people's family members, lovers, and sometimes gurus. So they don't behave in exactly the way the domestic violence perpetrator does, but that problem has been studied more than the one I'm talking about. And they use the terms coercive control, and they also use the term undue influence. Both of those terms are important in understanding the kind of narcissist that I'm describing. I want to say something else. You mentioned the idea of a predator and then parasite. That's exactly right, in my opinion. Because of the need to sustain the delusion of omnipotence. And why does somebody have to have a delusion of being superior and perfect and flawless and infallible? Because not to believe that would be so unbearably shameful. It's like most of these people have grown up having to overcome early in life the feeling of being powerless and humiliated. And their solution, some people would have that experience in life and become very depressed and spend a life of depression before they could get help. But these people start having fantasies of omnipotence. I'm the Incredible Hulk. I'm Superman. Nobody can humiliate me anymore. Those fantasies are what become delusions. And that delusion is so desperately in need of being sustained that they really have to find people to draw into their delusion and verify it for them. How do you verify that guy's delusion? You submit. So that's the predatory part. And the parasitic part is that narcissist needs that victim to verify their delusion. So they'll do anything to control and keep and basically enslave that victim because that's their supply and that's how they keep that delusion from crumbling.
I, I want to just interject. I think also, Dan, there's a third leg of the stool if we're talking Carl Jung, and that
Hmm.
is who didn't write about narcissism quite as much as Sigmund Freud did. But Carl Jung, what he wrote about it, he did think that it was not just a psychological issue, it was also a spiritual issue. That there's some malformation in this. And part of it comes from the persistent projection of shadow material onto others.
That's
So,
right.
in other words, you need plenty of people in your life that you can control to be able to project all of that negative, attitude and personality traits onto, rather
That's
than,
exactly right.
right? They can't coexist in the narcissist's mind, which means the narcissist can never be whole,
That's
because
right.
in other words, there's a missing piece there for them too, they keep transacting it out through projection onto other people.
Exactly. And what I believe gets projected, what the shadow material would be, is uh, a tremendous shame and fear of impotence, smallness, powerlessness, and defectiveness. They are also profoundly ashamed of dependence because dependence has proven to be humiliating for them.
Mm.
And that solution to project all of that, no, you're the dependent one, you're the shameful one, you're the needy one, you're the powerless one. That's what the people who come to see me while they're in or have left these relationships, they feel small and shameful and needy and frightened. And that's all been projected into them. That is what the narcissist has to do. To believe in his own delusion of omnipotence, I got to get all of that stuff I can't bear to acknowledge as within me. I have to just find a way to put it in you. And that's the parasitic nature and the projective nature of that kind of relationship.
I want to circle back to something you said earlier about
Of
cruelty,
course.
because sometimes I grow impatient with the therapeutic community. And the reason is because I see these definitions of narcissism as a lack of empathy.
Right, right.
And if you have been in relationship, either through a guru or a marriage or a love relationship with a narcissist, you understand firsthand lack of empathy. What an understatement. This is a deep capacity for cruelty. And I
I
don't,
think so.
do you think so too?
Yeah, I think that's what's important to understand, that the narcissist is so desperate to maintain control um, that one of the ways of I think it's sadistically cruel to make somebody feel bad about themselves. Let's just make it that simple.
Yeah.
Why do I need to make you feel bad about yourself? Well, does that, and if that makes me feel strong and powerful because I've made you feel afraid, intimidated, ashamed, that's just cruelty. And you're right. It's not just the lack of empathy. And in fact, some would say that it's hyper empathetic to understand exactly how vulnerable somebody is and to manipulate that vulnerability so that you can control that person and project what you need to project into them. Um, there's a case to be made for that, but I wouldn't call that empathy so much as, I don't know, Machiavellian cunning, something, um, something a little different from empathy, right? Um, yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Cruelty, that's the problem. See, my work doesn't involve trying to help narcissists figure themselves out and stop being narcissistic. They typically don't want to come to therapy. They typically want to, if they come as a couple and, the partner wants to try to work on the relationship and one of them is really this kind of narcissist, The minute the therapist tries to say, look, you might be part of the problem, that person, the narcissist, gets up and says, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know, you're just a rotten, lousy therapist and we quit. And they'll take their partner out of that therapy. So there are people who treat narcissistic personality disorder, and I have no grudge against them. I don't treat that. I treat victims who have been subjugated and traumatized by this kind of narcissist. So that's really a distinction I think is important. And most of the literature on narcissism is geared towards treating narcissistic disorders in people. That is Kernberg and Cohen are the two most famous American psychoanalytic thinkers on narcissism. They treated narcissistic disorders. That's not what I'm treating. I'm treating subjugation trauma. And I don't think that that's well enough understood as a necessary correlate to all the thinking about narcissism. So that's why I've been writing and thinking about this for 30 years, because I know what the victims deal with. And if a narcissist can be treated and cured of that narcissism, great. But who's taking care of these victims and understanding what they've been through? That's not given as much attention in the psychotherapy world. Although it is more so now. There's a lot more awareness of this now than there used to be.
Well, yeah, I think that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. When I was preparing for this, I decided that I just wanted to set aside this idea of why are narcissists narcissists? Why are they created? How are they created? Because there are so many diverse theories right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And part of this is being propelled by the internet, I think, in that, this topic has moved into every corner of the internet. And so much so that it seems like an epidemic. And I don't know how you feel about that as a clinician who is professionally trained to deal with this question of narcissism from the victim's point of view. How do you feel about all that?
I understand the impulse of people who have been abused by a narcissist to get out there, tell their story, invite others to tell the story. But I'll give you a kind of an analogy. When I first left the cult I was in 1994, I attended a conference for cult survivors, and those conferences are still held by the International Cultic Studies Association. So this was back in 94, my first conference. And what I observed at the time was that cult leaders are sociopaths, and they use mind control and thought reform techniques. Okay. So it was that simple. And I'm afraid some of what the pop psychology world thinks about narcissists is similar. It's that simple. They're just sociopathic, pathological, hypnotic people. And we don't have to look at the dynamic between the narcissist and the victim. We don't have to think about that. I think it's, there's just, I do use the term victim because that's very clear to me that people are victimized by this kind of narcissist. But victim is an important word to understand in a complex way. People who only identify as a victim tend to see everybody else as a perpetrator. I mean, I'm exaggerating that somewhat, but that's the slippery slope about a victim identity. And so I'm concerned in some of the popular forums for narcissism that people are encouraged to hate the narcissist, to go no contact with the narcissist, to view the narcissist as a completely psychopathic person. And that means that you don't have to deal with your conflict about how much you love that person, why you were vulnerable to that person. What do you need to know about yourself, about your own vulnerabilities that would help you realize why that person was able to coerce you and manipulate you. You see, so I, I, I fully acknowledge the victimization of people in these relationships, but I want to help people understand as fully as possible that there is a human being inside a narcissist, and there is a vulnerable person who is willing to give themselves over inside of us. And we have to know that about ourselves and about that person. There's I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to pronounce the name, but there's a South African female psychologist who went into the prison system after apartheid came down and interviewed one of the most malicious perpetrators of violence in South Africa. His name is de Kock. And she writes a book about how they formed a relationship, and it's called The Human Being Died That Night. What she was able to recognize was that within this incredibly evil person was a human being who had completely lost connection to their own humanity. So I say this not because I think it's important to forgive the traumatizing narcissist. That's neither here nor there as far as I'm concerned. What's important is to understand that those are human beings. We're human beings. They have their agenda and needs, and we have ours. And we have to learn we have to learn about ourselves, our vulnerabilities, our needs, what we want in a relationship. If we can learn about that, we don't have to get into these relationships repeatedly, which is unfortunately what happens to many people. They find themselves again and again.
Because they haven't looked at the vulnerability within themselves that led them into the relationship in the first place.
Right. And look, we all have attachment wounds. Nobody had perfectly secure attachment growing up, no matter how much love you experienced in your family. Even those highly secure people have areas of vulnerability about their security, about their sense of relational safety. And if you are in a period of your life when those vulnerabilities are closer to the surface, that's when you're vulnerable to the predatory narcissist. They see your attachment wounds, your wish for a perfect feeling of being perfectly secure in perfect love. And they see that and they know right how to go right in
and exploit it. Yes.
Yeah.
So I have to ask about no contact, because everything you've just said and everything I've picked up just in preparing for this interview is that the challenge for the victim is that if you're in a conversation with a narcissist whom you've been in relationship with, and they understand very intimately how to exploit you, that having any kind of constructive conversation is going to just end up in another subjugation. So
correct.
So
yes.
If you're not going no contact, what are you doing?
Right. Well, think of it this way. There are people for whom going no contact would be really harmful to them. For example, there are a lot of people who could lose a very significant inheritance were they to go no contact with their narcissist parent. Okay. Now, there's a level of cruelty and abuse at which I think we draw the line and we say, this is just, it's not possible for me to pretend even that we have a normal relationship. But for a lot of people, that's not the level of abuse they've experienced. When it is, I agree that it's probably most safe to just end all the contact. But a lot of people have experienced abuse at many levels below that, and they have a family that they don't want to divorce, or they share children with a partner whom the children are not alienated from, and perhaps you don't feel it's ethical to try to alienate your children from that partner. Again, the level of abuse would not rise to the level at which you would, for example, if you share children, if the level of abuse is at a certain place, I'm going to legally make sure my children have no contact with you, pedophilia, etc. But if it's not like that, if it's much more subtle and not quite as obvious, I don't want to alienate my children from you, and they don't want me to do that. And so we have to stay in contact. I just try to help people figure that out. Where are you on the spectrum? Is it best to stay in contact and figure out how to have internal boundaries, not ones that you're negotiating with the narcissist? They don't negotiate boundaries. No. They don't respect boundaries. But you can negotiate your own internal boundaries. And sometimes I say, look, just hold it together as best you can. Make shorter visits, not longer ones. Stay in a hotel if it's your family and you don't want to stay in the house. Act as if you're not angry, and act as if everything is normal and you know the truth. Get in and get out. So there's a lot of different ways to manage situations where you cannot go no contact. But the other problem with no contact is that predators use that. So this happens quite a lot. I get many calls from parents of an adult child who tell me that their adult child's, let's say, girlfriend, has convinced the adult child that the parents are toxic and they must cut off all contact. Well, that adult child's girlfriend is also isolating him from all of his friends, all of his family. One by one, she's convinced him that everyone he ever knew was toxic, and she has total control over him. That's called predatory alienation. And that person is telling their victim, you must go no contact. Another example is, I'm going to use Jehovah's Witnesses. They disfellowship anybody who says anything negative about the religion or who leaves the religion. So your parents and your children and your siblings will shun you and completely go no contact with you if you decide to leave that religion. So no contact is a protection on the one hand, but it can also be a weapon in the wrong hands. And so it's very important to be very thoughtful about no contact before you make a decision about that, before you let somebody talk you into it. And I really try to, I kind of tell people, look, let's turn over every stone. Is there a way not to go no contact and still keep you safe? And maybe we can find that way. And if we can't, then we do what we have to do.
Oh, that's reassuring to hear, because whenever I hear these sort of black and white decisions that people are forced into, and I think the other thing that happens is genuinely these victims, when they do come to this awareness that you're talking about, they realize that, the Wizard of Oz is just a short guy, behind the curtains, working the machinery. They feel duped. They feel like they put their heart and their vulnerability on the line only to have it used against them. And
absolutely,
there's a death of innocence.
True.
And
so true.
It makes people very angry,
Yes.
know? And so I can only imagine how difficult it is for you to have those conversations with people that where you're really trying to turn over every stone to get them to consider what might be better for them when their impulses are telling them to run like hell.
Right. Well, I think that's usually in the latter stage of the therapeutic work that we're trying to figure that out. Maybe there's a urgency about it. I have to go home for Christmas. I'm freaking out. I've figured out who's the narcissist and I'm remembering all the abuse and I have to still go home. What do I do? Well, we'll work out those strategies. We'll try to make it possible. But for any more final decisions, um, I think the more important work initially is to help people forgive themselves. They're angry at the narcissist, but who they're really angry at often is themselves. And it comes out, I was such an idiot. I can't believe how stupid I was. Why did I let it, God, I'm so weak. When you hear people talking that way about having left a narcissist, I take it very seriously because that's a legacy the narcissist left them with to alienate themselves from themselves.
You talk about this in the book. You talk about near the end this idea of self-alienation. And
it's crucial.
Yes. And I want to get into it, but here's what's bubbling to the top for me is this idea that, here you are, you have been subjugated by a cruel overmaster of one form or another. Judith Herman calls them captors.
Yes,
it held
that's
you
right.
hostage almost.
That's right.
And you have been dished out this cruelty. It takes an abundance of spiritual reckoning, I believe, to then say to yourself, you're not going to let it make you cruel.
That's right. That's the most important thing. And those people would not be cruel to anybody but themselves. Their internal cruelty is kind of the secret they're keeping. They might joke, "Oh, I'm such an idiot." Internally, the extent to which people are beating themselves up because of having let themselves be abused, let themselves is how they think of it, or having allowed themselves to be deceived or, having fallen for the narcissist. People's cruelty shows up nowhere else but internally. And that's what's extremely important to me in the work I do, to identify, to help people see and notice, and to try to figure out what's going on with that. If we can't figure out what that means, why that's necessary, and what are the other possibilities in terms of self-compassion, then that person remains in a way tied to the narcissist because they are agreeing with the narcissist that you're so weak and you're so dependent and you're so needy. So I don't want to leave anybody with that tie in the form of that self-negation. And the answer, it's a bit of maybe a cliche phrase. It could be oversimplistic to say, but without self-compassion, there really is no healing from trauma and abuse.
Well, you talk about dignity.
That's right.
That part of the healing process requires that the patient reclaims their dignity. And
yes,
I think that that's such an important choice of words because it is often, from everything I've studied, the subjugation requires a brutality, an emotional brutality where you are systematically breaking down another person's spirit.
That's right.
So they can be controlled.
That's right.
Right. And so,
yes.
And that many undignified things happen for that to be possible. And
that's right.
I looked into the roots of the word dignity, and
Mm,
Greek, Latin, and French,
mm,
and
mm,
roots, but they all seem to coalesce around the idea of worthiness. How apt
mhm.
is that for you?
Yes. No, absolutely. My colleague Richard Cheffetz in Washington, who is a wonderful, wonderful trauma therapist, a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist, he he wrote about this and inspired my thoughts about it. He said that dignity really is the opposite of shame.
Mm.
And the trauma survivor, more than anything, is struggling to manage overwhelming feelings of shame and fear. And reclaiming dignity is part of being able to forgive oneself and release oneself from shame, and to stabilize oneself and release oneself from fear. Stability and safety and dignity are the signs of healing from traumatic abuse.
Mhm.
And so that word really is important.
Is there anything you'd like to say, Dan, as we wrap up with you? This has been fantastic, by the way. Is there anything you'd like to say to people who might be listening and are caught up in a relationship with a narcissist and are being traumatized or feeling coerced or subjugated? What would you say?
Try not to hide what's happening from the people who love you. If you have friends and family who care about you, who you can trust, try not to pretend everything's okay. Try to tell them the truth. Try not to be ashamed of what's happening. Seek out people who you trust, who love you, who can help you release yourself from subjugation. The problem for so many people is that they're hiding all of it. In the cult, I was hiding it. I'm a spiritually happy person. I'm serene. No, that wasn't who I was at all. But that was that was my persona in the cult. And people in a marriage or people in a relationship, oh, it's great. We have our fights. People are ashamed to show what's really going on, and they're hiding it from the world, and they're kind of trying to pretend it isn't happening in themselves. If you can open up to a trusted, supporting, loving person and be honest, that can be the beginning of your recovery.
It's a beautiful place to end. Dan
Thank
Shaw.
you so much. These are wonderful questions. I so appreciate your close reading of what I'm trying to talk about and do in my work. And I really enjoyed talking with you, Patricia.
Oh, well, thank you, Dan Shaw. You are the author of the book, Traumatic Narcissism in Recovery, and thanks for joining us on Jung in the World. This is your host, Patricia Martin, signing off until next time.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2025 donors who gave at the supporting level and above. Arlo Kampen, Usha and Ashok Bedi, David Dalrymple in honor of Tom Kapasinskas, Peter Demuth, Mary Doherty, Carl Greer, Ken James, David Johnson, Mary Ann Johnson, John Manning in honor of Janine Mellinger, Mona Manning, Boris Matthews, Kenan McKee, Karen Newland, Murray Stein in honor of Lee Roloff, Mary Tice, Florence Tingley, Alexander Wayne, Ellen Young, and the Kapagantula Ramji Charitable Fund. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.